We're going to pick up where we left off with building our quiz game in React and translating it from our vanilla HTML, CSS, JavaScript version. Before we do that, though, I want to back up and talk at a high level about React again. Now that we've had some experience with React, some of this will make more sense, but React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It gives us a more maintainable way to architect our user interfaces compared to when we were just writing it in vanilla JavaScript. And some of the key principles that underpin React and why it is more maintainable than the vanilla approach is that it allows us to easily write our code in a component-based architecture, and it also lets us express our user interfaces in a declarative syntax. So let's talk about that component idea again. A component is really just a function that returns some JSX, some extended JavaScript syntax that allows us to express markup as well as embed JavaScript within it. So our component was just, when we wrote our code, a function that returned some JSX, and then we were able to put that on the page using React. This was a really simple component here that prints out a hello message. But if you take this further, and let's look at the Material UI library for React, which is a React implementation of Google's Material UI, and Material UI is a set of rules and constraints for how your application should look and feel. And this library gives you out of the box things like buttons that are styled and sort of interactive and have the animations of Google's Material UI. So you just import the library, you throw a button on the page, and you get all of this along for the ride. You have more interactive components like switches. And let's take a look at a couple others like an accordion and dialog boxes. So all of these are just components that you import into your application, throw them on the page using JavaScript JSX syntax, and the styling, the markup, the JavaScript all come along for the ride, bundled in that application, in that component. So this idea of component-based architecture is that we divide up our application into these smaller components that are then reusable. So you can imagine if we were building this dialog box, we might use this in multiple places across our application, so having this general purpose component that allows us to pop open a dialog box is great, and it is also something that we could potentially take from application to application. We design this component that pops open a dialog box in our first application, maybe we bring it over to the second one because it's easily portable. It's written as this reusable component. So that's the idea of components, and we'll come back and let's talk about this idea of declarative syntax. So declarative syntax looks like what we've been seeing already in these examples. We are just telling React, here is what the state of the application should be at any moment in time. It should be this div, it should say seconds, and then it should have this variable injected directly into the page. So the page should always have the latest version of this state, this variable seconds. And we can see that the result is that we have this page that is constantly updating. We don't have to write the code where we have to query selector to find this div on the page and update its text content or update its inner HTML. That part of the logic is handled for us by the React rendering engine and the React reconciliation engine. We just have to describe it at any moment in time. We just have to declare this is what the interface looks like. I should also mention that React isn't the only library that does this declarative and component-based idea of structuring our applications. There are libraries like Vue, which are similar, where you express a template, your sort of HTML with data and logic injected into it, your JavaScript, the logic of your application, and your styling. And a similar thing with Angular. It's a little bit heavier of a lift. It involves writing your code in a language called TypeScript, which is a typed version of JavaScript. So there are other options out there. This is just a really common paradigm right now for writing applications, is to use this component-based declarative syntax for expressing your user interfaces. We are using React in this course because it is one of the most popular, if not the most popular library out there in terms of employability and who's using React at the moment. But all of those other libraries are also good choices. And I'm only mentioning two, but there are other ones that are also up and coming, like Svelte. And while we're on this page, let's also talk about JSX. So on these examples, you can flip on and off JSX, and JSX is a language that browsers don't understand, so it's not something that we can author and then send directly to the browser. That is why we have this build step in our application now, where we write our code in JSX, but it has to be compiled, turned into vanilla JavaScript. And you can see what that compile step looks like here by flipping the JSX on and off. So for a simple component, what JSX is doing is just running this function that comes from the React library called createElement, which indicates that we should be creating a div. This is potentially an array of attributes here. There's nothing being passed in that go on the div, and then the children of that div show up as the following parameters. So the JavaScript, the JSX that you're writing here really just gets transformed into a function call. And sometimes that looks a little bit more complicated. Like if we scroll down to the to-do application, and let's look at the markup here. So we have a div with a h3 as a child, and then this to-do element, and then a form, and then a label as a child of that form. What it gets translated into is this React create element that says, here's a div, no attributes, and then as children, it should have all of these things. And then if we scroll down to our form, we can see that it's creating a form. It has these attributes and then has these child elements. So if we flip back and forth, we can see that the JSX is a little bit, well, for simple components, it is a little bit more readable. For more complex components, it's a lot more readable. It is technically optional, though it will be rare for you to find code that is written without JSX. So this idea of what it's being turned into will matter the deeper we get into React. It'll help explain why some things are possible and some things are not possible inside of your JSX markup. The last thing that I want to talk about here is how to read the documentation. So React actually has really great documentation. If you go to the React main page, there is a tutorial that walks you through building an application. And then there is the docs page, which has on the sidebar a bunch of different guides. So the getting started section has some like how do we spin up a React application type information. The main concepts has guides to the individual concepts inside of React. So there's a page on JSX and what JSX is and what JSX is not. There's a page on components and props. So the type of thing that we did last time, where we learned how to create a new component, how to specify some props, how to use those props. There's an article on state and lifecycle, which is what we'll be diving into when we get back into building our code, is learning how to maintain the state of our application. There's some more advanced concepts, like how do you take state in your application that needs to be accessed from deeply nested components and lift it up. There's a page on how to think in terms of React, like how do we break down a project that we want to build in React. Here are a bunch of steps. There are some advanced guides. And then there's the API reference. So if you want to dig into the React API, like what the code that you're importing from React looks like, this is the page to do it. So for instance, if we wanted to see that create element function, here is the definition of it. It says what element, the first parameter is what is the type of element that we should be creating. The next is an array of properties for that element. And then it's followed up with any number of child elements that you want to put inside of that element that we're creating here. So if you want to dig into the details of the React API, the API reference is here. And then I'll also point out that the hooks page, which is what we'll get into when we start dealing with state, these pages are really useful for learning what a hook is and how a hook works. So as you are developing a React application, especially the first few that you're developing, these pages are really good to have up and to refer back to when you hit issues or when you're trying to think through how to build your own application, as well as, you know, the default like Google. So when you hit a problem, Google is always useful. Just add the keyword of React and JavaScript or just React into the question that you're trying to Google. that's enough concept review for now. We're going to dig into the code in the next video.